So our first speaker is going to be Herb Jackson. He is the political editor, politics editor at CQ Roll Call. He is an alum of the Associated Press and several news organizations in New Jersey. He's also on the Press Club, National Press Club board. And he is going to talk about what you as a reporter can do to cover this issue. He has overseen the coverage of voting by mail for the primary so far this year, and he's developed a list of questions that he and his reporters ask about how to cover it if the issue is coming to your state. So Herb, welcome. Thanks for coming on today. So you prepared an excellent handout for journalists, 6 questions to ask about mail-in voting. That handout will be made available to all of the viewers of this. It'll be on our website. It's a good resource for you. It has the questions itself as well as links to other resources within there. But Herb, let's go through these a little bit. You have 6 key questions. The first 3 of them deal with the ballots themselves. Can you maybe give us a sense? What are those three
Sure.
key ballot-related questions?
Sure. I mean, the first one is, of course, who gets a ballot. In some states, you have to have an excuse to not vote in person, and is fear of getting COVID-19 an excuse? Some states, election officials are doing mass mailings. It's important to make clear: are they mailing out applications or are they mailing out actual ballots? And if they are mailing things out unsolicited, who are they sending it to? In some cases, they're talking about active voters, and that raises the question: how do they decide who's an active and an inactive voter? Because in some cases, it depends on whether you voted in a certain number of elections recently. And what happens if you only vote in the presidential year and you didn't vote in the previous 3 years? Are you still considered active? In some places, you can apply online, and that raises questions about whether that's a secure way to apply, because how do they double check that you are who you say you are? And the other thing that this emphasizes is the importance of the accuracy of the lists that they use and who is protecting those lists from hacking. The next question is, once you get a ballot, how do they protect the integrity of that ballot? Because we talk about fraud a lot. Fraud did happen in 2018. There was an election in North Carolina in the 9th district where they threw out the election results because a Republican consultant, according to the Board of Elections, may have gathered up ballots in rural areas and not returned some of them because he didn't think they were going to vote the right way. The district had no representation for most of 2019 until they ran a redo election. So you have questions that you're going to ask when they get the absentee ballot. Are they checking signatures? If they check signatures and think a ballot is invalid, does the voter get a chance to correct that error or cure an error? Are they notified? And then, other question is, when I'm got a ballot, I voted today in the District of Columbia special election in my ward for the city council.
You got your pen right.
I got my sticker here, yes. And this ballot return was postage paid. I was able to have it postmarked by today, but it's very important if you're going to write about this, and maybe you want to get election officials on Facebook Live or in a Reddit Ask Me Anything room, but answer any of the voters' questions. Can they drop them off at boxes? Where are those boxes? How late are they open? Is the cutoff for the ballot to be received on election day or postmarked on election day? The Supreme Court seems to have thrown the postmarked question into a Wisconsin case that Wendy's probably going to talk a lot about later. Can someone else bring your ballot in? Can campaigns pay someone to go out and knock on the doors of people who have received ballots and ask them if they want them to pick them up? Is no one allowed to return your ballot? Can your wife or your roommate? And in North Carolina also, they just ruled that some organization was sending partially filled out applications to thousands of voters. And that violated their law that says only the voter can fill out the form. So if it already came with your name pre-written in your address, if that gets sent back in North Carolina, that's not going to count.
Okay, so I just want to show our show our viewers the 6 questions. So this will be online, so all of you have access to this. But Herb, if you could maybe talk a little bit more about the other questions that you have, dealing with other options, dealing with absentee voting, and then dealing with how all of this is going to be paid for.
Sure.
So give us
Absolutely.
the other 3 questions that journalists out there should be asking.
Well, one thing we saw already is just making it easier for people to vote by mail doesn't mean that people don't want to vote in person. And in fact, one of my colleagues has done some reporting that among Black voters especially, they're distrustful of mailing in the ballot because they're not sure it's going to be counted the same way as if they go in and vote on the machine. They fought for the right, their ancestors fought for the right for them to be able to go in and vote on that machine. So now you've got to have places for people to go who still want to vote in person. But the problem we're having right now because of the pandemic is who usually works at the polls is elderly people who are more susceptible to the virus. They don't want to work at the poll site. So what we've had is polling sites are consolidated. And what happens is then, you know, people don't know where to go, or the people who work there don't have as much training, or they just have to deal with a lot of check-in that they don't normally deal with when you're dealing with a simple precinct site. So they have to make sure they give people the right ballots. That makes lines taking longer. The other thing you have to ask is what happens if somebody gets an absentee ballot and then goes and votes in a real in-person place? And this happened with a candidate in Georgia who had to actually fill out an affidavit saying, I never got my mail-in ballot. And it said, then the mail-in ballot would, if it is received, is invalidated, right? Because once he voted in the machine, his vote went in and nobody knows how to take that out if it later turned out that he voted twice. But you have to ask, how many in-person sites are there going to be, and how are they going to be staffed? And then don't forget that there are going to be mistakes. This ballot I held up before is not mine. The District of Columbia sent me somebody else's ballot along with mine and my wife's. So I called them and said, how did this happen? They just said, we'll fix it. Don't use that. That's what their answer was. Counting the ballots is another question. We still don't have results from one of the Georgia primaries that was held last Tuesday. Another one in Nevada was settled at 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon. If you're going to say that the ballots that are postmarked on election day are counted, you have to wait for those ballots to show up. And there are going to be races that aren't going to be called for some time. Last year, in the last cycle in 2018, there was a group of maybe members showing up at House orientation because we still didn't know who had won their races. And then finally, the question is, how do you pay for all this? There's extra printing, there's extra postage, there's extra staff to process the applications and then take the ballots and open them. There are machines, because there are several states that have been doing all mail voting for many years. They have machines, they have equipments, they have barcodes on the ballot. In March, the House started doing a coronavirus response bill. The House had recommended $4 billion to give to states to deal with this. When it finally came out of the Senate, it only had $400 million. And there was also a requirement that the states had to put up a 20% match. This is at the time that the states have no revenue because nobody's paying taxes because nobody's working. The House approved another $3.6 billion in a $3 trillion bill that they approved in May. The Senate hasn't acted on that, but we understand that the Senate is still talking about more money to go to states. But the question becomes, when does the federal government approve it? Then how fast can it get out there? And do the states have to be ordering all this printing now? You know, these are things that you should be asking. And like I said, do Facebook Live groups with voting officials in your district, and let the voters themselves see it and hear it, and answer questions because they're going to think of things I didn't ask.
Okay. The errant ballot that you have, was that a mailing issue where they mailed it to your house, or did they actually have your name and the wrong address?
It had somebody else's name and my address.
Okay.
And it is not somebody whose mail comes to my house often. I looked it up. He lives in Northeast. He's 91 years old. I think somebody just typed it in when they're doing a lot of applications. I did ask if somebody in the Board of Elections could call me back, because, you know, I'd like to write a column about how this happened, but they did not get back to me. So
Okay.
if it turns out, I'll let you know.
All right, good deal. So we'll come back to you for some questions in a bit. Just a note to our viewers, CQ Roll Call is a partner with us on this program today. And the sponsor of the program is Arnold Ventures. And so we want to thank both of them for their partnership and sponsorship of this program. Next, we are going to hear from Adam Bonica, who is an assistant professor of political science at Stanford University. His research focuses on ideology, campaign finance, and interest group politics. He comes to Stanford by way of the University of Portland and then got his PhD at New York University. So I invited Adam here because he and his colleagues, Charlotte Hill, Jacob Grumbach, and Hakeem Jefferson, had a piece in the New York Times a few weeks ago. We should never have to vote in person again. There'll be a link to that for all of you, all of our viewers. And that was associated with the working paper they have about all mail voting in Colorado and how that increases turnout and reduces turnout inequality. So I've asked him to come talk about that, about the issue of turnout and that program or that paper specifically. So Adam, let me just start out asking you about, you know, you studied Colorado, and I want to kind of have you talk about that. But how different is the Colorado model compared with other states out there, like Oregon, which we'll hear about a lot today, and other states? So what is it that Colorado's doing?
So Colorado is similar to Oregon and Washington in that the emphasis is on all mail voting. There is some important differences whereas Oregon does not have same-day registration because they're completely all mail voting. There are still in-person voting stations operating in Colorado. And so the opportunities to vote are a little more expansive in Colorado than what you see in Oregon and Washington. But overall, the system, most people in these states are voting by mail.
Okay, so tell us about the Colorado system, the Colorado experiment, or what Colorado has done. You have a slideshow that you're going to share with us, but so you can pull that up. But tell us, you know, a little bit about how long it took Colorado to ramp up to this, and then tell us about your research and what you found.
Yeah, so Colorado switched over to an all-mail voting system in 2014, and it appears to have been a very successful transfer over to vote by mail. And they also retained features like the same-day registration. And now Colorado has joined Oregon in moving towards automatic voter registration, which is another important step for increasing turnout because registration is a pretty big barrier. And so be a good time to maybe share my slides and sort of explain a little bit about how we conducted this study. For the study, what we were able to do was use the national level voter file. So this takes all the state level voter files, which has every registered voter in the country. And it provides a lot of really detailed information, including their voting history in current and past election cycles. So what this allowed us to do was to create what's called a panel, which means we could take millions of voters, individual voters, who had registered in this case before 2010, where our study begins, and then track how they voted over a 5-year period, a 5-cycle period, so through the next 5 election cycles. And then so we could take Colorado and then compare it to, in this case, 3 control states, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. And also we have other versions of the model that we used where we matched each voter in Colorado against a voter outside the state who was of the same age and had the same voting history prior to 2014. And so basically what we're doing is we have the entire universe of all the registered voters, and we see who's voting and how those voting patterns changed in Colorado relative to other states after the implementation of these election reforms in 2014. And so what we found in terms of changes to turnout was quite striking, actually. Overall, it looks as though the Colorado reforms were very successful in increasing and boosting voter turnout. And so we're basically measuring the increase in turnout for the 2014, 2016, and 2018 election cycle, so over the three election cycle period. And what this graph is showing is that we saw increases in turnout across the entire voting population, across the entire age distribution in Colorado. So this line up here is showing the actual turnout in Colorado in 2018 versus the expected turnout had Colorado not transitioned over to an all-mail voting system. And the increase was by far largest among youngest voters. That's where you saw, by and large, almost a 15-point increase among the youngest cohorts of voters during this period in this transition. And this is consistent with what we've seen in Oregon, for instance, which has very high youth turnout as well. This is important because young people are the least likely to turn out to vote. We also were able to look at some more detailed demographic data that was included in the voter file as well. And this is just showing the breakdown of how what the effect size looks like for race, educational attainment, and wealth levels. We're also able to look at income levels, which aren't shown here, but the results are similar. And what we see across the board is that groups that have been traditionally lower propensity voters tended to see the largest increases in terms of overall turnout. So this includes people of color, people with less than a high school diploma or less than a graduate degree. And then importantly, we saw the pretty large differences with respect to wealth and income, where the lowest wealth and the least wealthy households were the ones that saw the largest increase. And as a note about sort of how we are interpreting these results, consistent is we also can look at data from the current population survey, which had traditionally, before voter files became more available to political scientists, had been the main way the political scientists would study voting patterns. And one of the questions they include in the census study, in the census survey, the current population survey, is they ask people who didn't vote their main reason for not voting. And consistently, the most common response is that they had scheduling conflicts with work or school is their main reason for not turning out to vote. The point being that one of the reasons these vote-at-home systems maybe are likely increasing turnout is that it's sort of leveling the playing field. And what this graph is showing is that among the percentage of people who say that the reason they don't vote is because they just didn't have time to, they were too busy to go out and wait in line at the polls, they're primarily concentrated among the youngest people. And you see that the percentage of people who say this is increasing, and this is just among non-voters, right? And so this is consistent with the claim that even above and beyond this question of whether transitioning to these systems in the long term, which I think is important to consider, not just in the short term where I think it's a little more of a no-brainer, is that convenience really matters. Even if we didn't find that making voting easier and more convenient didn't increase turnout, and it does, we still as citizens should really expect states to try to make it as convenient as possible. And an analogy I would use here would be if you could imagine that we all had to pay our internet bill in person on a work day, potentially waiting in line for hours. Most of us would still do it. We need the internet and we don't really have a choice of providers, but we'd be upset about it. And so when we look at voting, where there are all these barriers to voting that are set up, I think it's important to keep in mind that a well-functioning system for value democracy is most likely one that's going to be both convenient and secure. And so, this is largely what we see when you make voting more convenient through vote by mail. We do seem to see very large effects in terms of the overall changes. And one final note is we're just looking at the transition in Colorado. And it's not as if the transition to vote by mail is going to be equally effective everywhere that it's implemented. Mileage may vary. It does matter about implementation. So a lot of the questions that Herb brought up about where are the drop boxes, does everyone have to mail in their ballot, or can they go walk to their library and just drop it off? These are important questions about implementation that I think are also key to sort of think about in terms of looking at this issue. That election officials should also have these questions in mind as well as reporters, I think.
We'll turn it over to Wendy in a second here, but I want to ask a couple of very kind of technical questions about the data sources that you used, which might be of interest to journalists out there. The voter file data. Explain again how that is compiled, and is that something that is accessible easily through states, and are there commercial services that compile it? Is this something that journalists have used and would have access to?
So journalists have used this in the past. I think often it's done in partnership with academics. So the way you access it, there are a number of commercial firms that compile this data, and the firm we used was L2. There's also Catalyst, Target Smart. There are a number of groups that compile these voter lists. But you need a license to it, and they're pretty expensive. So my university has a license, which allowed us to use it. But some states make the voter file pretty much publicly accessible, like Florida and Ohio, where you don't need to go out of the way and purchase it. But I have seen journalists use this with some frequency, usually looking up individuals, like, for instance, the president and how the president voted.
Okay, and finally, another data question. Your slide on why people didn't vote comes from Census Bureau data. Could you tell us which survey is that? And is that a question they ask on an ongoing basis? Yeah,
so they ask that every other November. So in the November supplements, the current population study, and it's usually around 60 to 70,000 individuals that are, and so it's based off of the same studies that are being conducted to ask questions about the economy. And they just tack on questions about turnout in the November supplements.
Okay. All right. We'll turn it over to Wendy in 1 second, but we do have a audio question right now. So we're going to turn the microphone over to Charlotte Lebov. Hope I'm getting the name correctly. So Charlotte, you should be unmuted and you can ask your question.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm a freelancer. I live in Florida. And when people ask me about mail-in voting, I really don't know what to tell them, because an analysis by the Miami Herald of the last 2 presidential elections showed that if you voted by mail, your chances were 1 in 10 that it wouldn't count. That this happened with the ballots that were rejected were mostly in areas where younger people and minorities lived. And they were very unlikely to rectify the problem when they got the chance to, quote, cure the ballot. And another analysis in Miami showed that I think something like 6,000 ballots were rejected because they supposedly came too late. And Florida, as we all know, is a very key state. So what are your comments? What can I tell people about it?
I guess anybody, Wendy, you want to tackle that one?
Absolutely. So there are, in the midst of a pandemic, we are going to absolutely see, and we are already seeing, as I'll talk about in a moment, a surge in demand for absentee and mail voting, because that's, for many people, that will be their only safe way of participating. And that doesn't mean that there aren't problems with absentee and mail voting and how that the rules are fair in every single state. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the lawsuits that are going on, because there are, in places like Colorado, they have gone a lot farther along the way to making sure that the rules are fair and that it is accessible to everyone. In places like Florida, where this was a smaller portion of the voting in that state, there are more obstacles, and some of those are going to be fought out in court.
Okay. So let's hear from Wendy a bit more. Wendy Weiser, for full identification, directs the democracy program at the Brennan Center for Justice at the NYU School of Law. Her program focuses on voting rights and elections, money in politics and ethics, redistricting and representation, rule of law, and fair courts. Wendy, you are going to talk about the surge that we've seen in absentee and mail ballots. So maybe you could just start there. Tell us what kind of increase have we seen, and then tell us a little bit about some of the legal challenges that are underway right now.
Sure. And I hope this screen sharing has worked.
Yes, we can see it fine.
So as I started before, absentee balloting and mail balloting is deeply embedded already in the American electoral system. Every single state uses it, has used it for a very long time. And as Adam pointed out, there are 5 states where this is the principal method of voting. Colorado is one of the latest. And for military and overseas voters as well, that is the principal method of voting. That said, in most states, the absentee voting was a minor method of voting. I'd say in more than half, it was less than 10% of voters voted by mail in 2016, 2018. Overall, nationally, for the last 3 federal elections, it's been roughly a quarter of Americans have used absentee voting. This year, in response to the pandemic, we are seeing a dramatic surge in the demand for and in the use of absentee and mail ballots. That it varies state by state what they call them and precisely how they go. This is just a sampling of some recent states and primaries to show that you can see in some states where it went down from single digits to super majorities of voters. In states like Nevada, they were practically almost all mail ballots during the primary elections. One of the reasons why that is important to see is that in much of the country, we haven't scrutinized the fairness and accessibility of our absentee or mail voting rules, because most voters and the political culture was such that most voters actually voted in polling places. And so there was a reasonable alternative way that was where most of the election was held. In this election, as you can see by what's happening, and these are just some, every single state has had similar numbers. Most of the voting is going to take place by mail or absentee ballots, assuming that the current trends hold as we expect them to, as we expect the coronavirus to continue. And so what we've seen then as a result is a surge in conflict and scrutiny over those voting rules. Should I move on to that now?
Yes, please.
So as you can see here, in most of the country, in 36 states, there are lawsuits going on around fighting over the voting rules and access to absentee voting. This is a new surge of litigation. We have seen continuous litigation, certainly over the last decade, really more since Bush v. Gore, an increasing set of litigation over voting rules generally, but this is a sort of uniquely high surge, all clustered around coronavirus-related concerns in the voting system. And the issues map on to the questions that Herb was mentioned earlier that really are the same questions everybody wants to know about the voting system. And so I've listed here the main barriers to mail voting that exist across the country. This maps onto the lawsuits, I want to say. So the first kind of category of lawsuits that we're seeing in many states are in the 15 states that don't allow every voter to cast a ballot without providing any reason, the excuse states. There is litigation where the legislatures or the executive have not already said that the coronavirus should be an excuse over whether or not under that state's absentee voting rules, the coronavirus should count as an excuse, whether everyone should be entitled to a ballot. And there's been some mixed results in that litigation. We're seeing this in federal and state cases. There's been a recent favorable ruling enabling everybody to access absentee ballots in Tennessee, but there have been unfavorable rulings in Texas and South Carolina, in Missouri. These litigations aren't over, but that this is mixed results. There are ongoing cases that still haven't seen rulings. One of the interesting points is that in the 15 states that require an excuse, 12 of them actually did already made it so that every voter could obtain an absentee or mail ballot for the primary elections, but only 2 now it's moved up to 4, have already done that for the November election. So that's still a live issue. Another big issue, and I'm going to go through categories of issues and we can get into the details, are how accessible are these ballots? There have been some jurisdictions that have chosen to mail everybody absentee ballot application forms. In the states that aren't vote by mail states, people don't get ballots automatically sent to every registered voter. There have been some jurisdictions who've moved temporarily to a full mail voting system and sent everybody a ballot as well. That has spawned some litigation on both ends, some from groups seeking to force the state to mail everybody at least an application, and some for those that said that election officials or governors have exceeded their authority in sending people applications or ballots. And that's going on in the courts right now with mixed results as well. There's a pile of obstacles now about casting a ballot. There are some states, as I note here, that have requirements that the ballot be notarized or that there be witnesses that sign that ballot, which is a special challenge for people who are in quarantine. Same with documentary forms of identification that need to be sent either with the ballot or the ballot application. Again, a challenge for people who can't go into government offices. There is litigation challenging those requirements. Those have actually have been breaking in favor of the challengers across the country. There have been, in many states, there are also lawsuits challenging the requirement that voters affix postage to the ballot or the ballot application, trying to say that that's either a poll tax or creates an undue burden on voting rights. Those have not been breaking in favor of voters. Those have been by and large rejected so far. There are lawsuits that where the voting rights advocates are winning, asking for notice and an opportunity to cure defects in absentee ballots. And I think that was something that Adam mentioned, that's one of the things that lead to high rates of uncounted ballots, which is if when election officials are verifying the ballot, if they notice a signature mismatch or you've left off your some identifying information that they're using to verify your ballot. In many states now, election officials are required to provide voters with prompt notice and an opportunity to cure that defect. And now courts are now requiring that, introducing that requirement in states that don't already require that. Another big issue is ballots, that was also mentioned by Adam, are that in most states right now that don't vote principally by mail, ballots that are sent by election day but received after election day are not counted as a matter of law under those state laws. That is turning out to be a dramatic barrier in the time of coronavirus, in the time where already we're seeing significant delays in processing ballot requests. We are also seeing significant mail delays so that people aren't necessarily able to receive their ballot on time or cast them on time with those deadlines. We've seen mixed results in the courts as to, depending on how close to the actual election and how much opportunity voters actually have to get their ballot in those lawsuits. But that will continue through November. We are seeing now an increasing number of lawsuits also responding to the actual administration of the elections, the processing failures, also not having sufficient polling places open, as we're seeing now in state after state, as we're seeing not everybody's able to access a mail ballot. There aren't sufficient polling places to serve the remaining voters who want to participate. There aren't sufficient poll workers at the polling places. There isn't sufficient equipment at that polling places. And so we're seeing what are unconscionably long lines, especially in in cities and in densely populated, especially minority communities.
Okay, so let me ask you a question about the the rundown of all the states. Where can reporters go to keep up to date on all of these? You mentioned one particular blog that has done a pretty good job of kind of compiling all the information and keeping it up to date. Can you tell us what that source is?
Yeah, so there are a few places to go. Law professor Justin Levitt of Loyola Law School has recently just compiled a list of all of these lawsuits that he's made available online. The Brennan Center is going to have an updated site that's also keeping track of all of the status of these litigations as well. There is a more detailed website at the Moritz College of Law at Ohio State University that actually compiles and has links to every single lawsuit dealing with the election system, and they've been keeping that up for many years. And I also have found that there are some journalism outfits that have been doing a good job of keeping on top of this, and I want to commend in particular Election Land that has a fairly comprehensive list that it's been keeping up to date of legal developments and lawsuits.
Okay, if you can maybe stop sharing right now. I think we'll come back to the fraud slide in a bit because I think that's what some of our questions will be about. But we do have several questions. I'm going to turn the mic over to some of these folks, but I do want to let all of the viewers know that we'll be posting resources from the Brennan Center, from Adam's study, as well as a lot of other places that are compiling good information on voting by mail systems. The National Conference of State Legislatures, the United States Election Project, where a professor at the University of Florida has tracked voter turnout from 1787 to 2018. The National Vote at Home Institute, which does researches and advocates on vote at home systems, but it also does an outstanding job of tracking media coverage of the issue, and it has a wealth of resources you can turn to. There's a few reports from the Congressional Research Service and the GAO dealing with voting by mail. The U.S. Election Assistance Commission, which was created by Congress in 2002, has a lot of resources, including a pretty detailed timeline about how long it will take a state to get a vote by mail system up to date or implemented. And so we will have links to all of those resources. But I do want to take some questions from some of our viewers out there. We have Emily Wilkins, who is with Bloomberg Government. Emily, we are turning the mic over to you. So you can ask your question. You there, Emily? Emily is not there. Well, let's turn to Deborah Berry from USA Today. If we can get Deborah unmuted. Deborah, floor is yours.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for the panel. Several of you mentioned the movement toward absentee and mail-in ballots. Can you explain then what happened in DC in particular, where they had the option, where voters had the option of early voting? The officials were pushing hard on absentee ballots, but people showed up on June 2nd and there were long lines. They waited for hours. Are people leery of the mail-in system? Is this a sign of what's likely to happen in other places? And are voters just going to be turned off by showing up in November?
Kind of anybody, I guess any of you. When do you want to grab that one?
I'll start, and Adam, you should feel free to jump in. I think that there are a couple of points I want to make. First, in many jurisdictions, this surge in mail voting and absentee voting is something that they have never prepared for before. Is learning to build a whole new election system from scratch on a very short timeline in a very high pressure situation. So we are going to see glitches. They are also, and the biggest obstacle that we're seeing across the country, dramatically under-resourced. Okay. In order to be able to make all of the adjustments that are needed to be made to have a safe and healthy polling places and to be able to process this dramatic increase in absentee voting, election officials need new equipment, new staffing, to order new ballots and postage. They need significantly more resources than what they already have. And I think that that's some of the what we're seeing in DC very dramatically, but not only in DC, across the country, these systems being pushed past their breaking points. They cannot accommodate this surge and make this change without an infusion of resources, an infusion that can only come from Congress. Congress has given a tiny amount, a tiny fraction of what is needed, 400 million. They need 4 billion, which is only a tiny drop in the bucket compared to the stimulus funds. But that's one of the most significant things we're seeing.
Okay.
Can I jump in? And so I think there is some evidence that voters, especially in states who haven't experienced all-mail elections, are a bit wary about the transition. And so the Pew Research Center did a study on support for different voting reforms back in 2018. And conducting all-mail elections was the least popular of all the different reforms that they had surveyed. But on the flip side of that, states that have implemented vote by mail, after it's been implemented, it turns out to be very popular once people get used to it and are experienced with it. So I imagine what we're seeing may be partly some wariness about the transition. But I think once these systems are in place and they're working, people favor them very, very widely. So there was a study done in Oregon after the transition to vote by mail, and it was 81% of people said they preferred voting by mail versus voting in person. And so I think it's a before and after system, but the transition right now really does matter. So I think it is something we should be aware of.
Okay, so let's turn the mic over to Ben Christopher, a reporter with Cal Matters. Ben, we're getting you unmuted, and the floor is yours, Ben.
Hey, thanks. And thanks to everyone for doing this. This has been really great. So I've read of research showing that expanding vote by mail opportunities doesn't necessarily confer an advantage to one party or another, at least systematically. But I was thinking about that when I was looking at the slides that Professor Bonica showed, that at least in Colorado, we saw the largest increase over what we might have expected among young voters and voters of color and lower income voters, which are demographic groups that I think tend to lean Democratic. So I'm just wondering how we should kind of square those two facts, and if there are any sort of caveats we should keep in mind when we're thinking about this research.
Yeah, Ben, thanks for that question. There's like two points to this. One, we looked at whether the increase in turnout in Colorado among Democrats versus Republicans was substantially different. And we didn't find that. We found that it increased turnout among both Democrats and Republicans by similar amounts. Where we saw really large increases were among independent voters. And that's largely because younger voters are much more likely to register as independents. But on the flip side, there's the question about whether it instills a partisan advantage, I think is one we should really be careful about. Because often what we're actually observing is that Republicans are already turning out at much higher rates than Democrats in these states. And so there's a lot of evidence that the playing field has been tilted in favor of Republican constituencies for quite some time. And vote by mail isn't making it expressly easier for Democrats to turn out. It's just making it easier for everyone to turn out. It's leveling the playing field. And so if we're looking at this question of whether, reform can't be implemented because it may help one or the other party, I think that can be very sort of damaging to the overall cause of making a better working democracy more accessible to everyone, because that will necessarily be the case, given the patterns we've seen in terms of partisan differentials in most of these states.
I also wanted to just add one other factor, which is that the strains and problems in the implementation and in the rules failures of mail voting are disproportionately harming voters of color and younger voters. And we're seeing this again and again, but there was a study that one of the callers mentioned out of the University of Florida that looked at, and it's one of multiple such examinations that looked at whose ballots were rejected and found that voters 18 to 21 were 5 times more likely to have their mail ballot rejected for like a signature mismatch or something. And also voters that were African American and Latino were 2 times more likely than white voters to have their ballots rejected. We're seeing similar disparities now anecdotally, but I suspect it'll be consistent as it has been in each state so far, where the processing delays and failures are especially hitting communities of color, as are the long lines that are resulting from the insufficient preparedness of the system. So I think that it cuts, that's another factor to keep in mind this year.
That study you're referencing there from Miami or from Florida, when was that, and like who's the author? I'd like to try to track that down to share with our viewers.
It's Dan Smith. It's a group of researchers. The lead researcher was Dan Smith.
Okay.
It's recent. It was in the last election.
Got it. Okay, so Emily Wilkins has a problem with her microphone. From Emily. Emily is from Bloomberg Government, but she has texted in her question. This one might work for you, Herb. Her question is, we've seen rough primaries in Wisconsin and Georgia. What other states should reporters keep an eye on that might struggle with primaries during COVID-19? Do you have a sense of that?
I haven't seen one that did it all great yet. I mean, you know, there were big tie-ups in Las Vegas. There were big tie-ups in Baltimore. You know, we've got voting next week in Virginia, North Carolina runoff, Mississippi, Kentucky. I mean, we're watching them all, and similar patterns are playing out. Now, the question is whether these states are seeing what the states before them did and making adjustments and having more in-person locations. And you know, the question from California, the reporter probably knows that in a special election in California earlier this year, the positioning of a new in-person polling place was decried by the president as an attempt to steal the election, even though it was a Republican mayor who had supported putting an extra polling place in that town. There seem to be voters who just don't trust voting by mail, and maybe it's, as Adam says, that they just haven't had experience with it yet. I know that I was a little surprised, again, to go back to the ballot I filed this afternoon, that there wasn't a security envelope in it, that my ballot actually went in an envelope with my name on it. If anybody really wants to know how I voted in Ward 2, you know, I guess you could find out if you want to open my mail. But you know, but the fact is that every race right now seems to have moved almost exclusively to online because they don't think they can run the local polling places that they normally do, partly because they're also typically in schools and senior centers and places where they don't want large groups traipsing through because they may bring the virus with them and leave it there. So, you know, that's the answer. Sorry, Emily, that it's just like all of them.
Okay. So, yeah, Herb, I guess Wendy or Adam, do you have any sense of other potential problem states that you could list off quickly?
I think the way I agree with what Herb said, that every state that doesn't already vote, have a majority of their ballots cast by mail, is a potential significant problem state, especially without any significant infusion of congressionally appropriated resources. I also think that the battleground states are the ones that we're going to notice most. There was like major glitches in Tennessee, where the secretary, where the election officials failed to send out half the absentee ballots that were requested by some computer error, and we just haven't heard about that nationwide. So I do think that one of the things that we learn from the fact that there are going to be these glitches is that we need to have multiple layers of fail-safes in place so that these glitches don't undermine the elections, that they don't prevent people from casting ballots that will count. That means people should have places that they can drop off their absentee and mail ballots, like secure drop boxes or drop-off locations. It means that we need an adequate supply of safe and healthy polling places, and we need to site them properly so that they're not in senior centers or schools. And we need to consider also extending deadlines for the ballots. So just among some of the fail-safes that need to be in place, we need to plan for glitches and make sure we have lots of paper backup emergency ballots and ballots at polling places, and paper registration rolls as well.
So let me have a general question about, voting by mail outside of the U.S. I mean, what is the history of voting by mail in other countries? And I guess there's a story out today about Vladimir Putin in Russia is saying that he wants to do some sort of voting by internet. Have countries experimented with that? And what's the history of that?
Do you want to start, Adam?
I'm honestly not terribly familiar with vote by mail in other countries. The only place that I know that's that I'm familiar with from studies is Switzerland, where like the U.S., they have a very complicated ballot. And one of the things that I think the U.S. does differently than the rest of the world is, we ask people to vote on a lot of different issues all at the same time. And so it's not terribly surprising that it's also been implemented in Switzerland, where we saw marginal increases in turnout. But most studies that I have seen have suggested that remote voting does increase turnout by at least a few percentage points.
Okay. And Wendy, do you have any thoughts on that and about the Putin idea?
Well, yeah, so I'll add on just a cautionary statement relating to online voting. It is our belief and the belief of all leading experts in cybersecurity and computer science and election infrastructure that online voting is just not secure at this time. This is not something that we can actually safely do in this country. And I think the reason why you raised Vladimir Putin is in fact one of the reasons why we are concerned with the security of online voting is that as our law enforcement and intelligence, all of our law enforcement intelligence agencies warn, Vladimir Putin and other foreign adversaries are still working very hard right now to try to engage in cyber attacks and interfere in our elections. And so maybe he's not interfering in Russia's elections, or maybe he's, or maybe he is, but I think we want to make sure that we have a secure infrastructure to prevent that. In addition to preventing breaches, we also need to make sure that we have all of these resiliency measures in place, all of these backup systems, so that if there are any attacks, again, it doesn't prevent the election from moving forward and accurately recording everyone's votes.
Okay.
The other thing I would make sure we realize is every state does it different, right? I mean, some states you have to get more than 50% in the primary or there's a runoff. And in some states, the party can choose whether there's a convention or a primary. And, in some states, it's easy to get on the ballot because you only need 200 signatures. In other places, you need a certain number of signatures from each, subdivision there. And, we have 50 different states, and within the states, a lot of the administration is done at the county level. So in, the state I covered for most of my career, New Jersey, it's got 21 counties, but there's 21 different boards of elections using different voting machines. So, you can't even just implement a thing like, let's all go with this paper ballot, because you have to go out to bid in 21 counties. It's ridiculously complex, and it's a matter of home rule. It's a matter of federalism, I guess. Congress can try to get involved, but one of the things that's really the Democrats and Republicans are bumping up against is Republicans do not in Congress want the federal government to be an election administrator. They will support giving money to the states so that they can use it. But the Congress and federal government do not really regulate how elections happen, except to the extent that, the Constitution says, you have to be 25 years old to be in the House and 30 years to be in the Senate and 45 to be the president. But, when California tried to say the presidential candidates have to release their tax returns, it got thrown out because that's not a qualification that's in the Constitution. So it's a state level thing that makes comparing to other nations really difficult.
Okay, so it's 1 o'clock right now, but we still have some other questions in the queue. So as long as our panelists are still with us here, we will go a few minutes over to pull in some of these questions. Right now, this is Mark Albert from the Hearst, Washington Bureau. He's investigative editor there. In one of Wendy's slides, it mentioned most states do not provide prepaid postage on the vote by mail envelopes. Are you aware of any state-by-state estimates for how much money that would cost to add, such as, X million dollars in X state?
Absolutely. The Brennan Center has produced such estimates. We both did a national estimate of the cost of that, but we actually did a very deep dive study looking into 5 states. Not just the costs of postage, but all of the new costs of election administration that they need to incur, working very closely both with state election officials and with local election officials and with their vendors. And so we actually have the very specific price tags, the low end and the high end for each and every one of those. Happy to share those. And the states that we looked at in great detail were, if I get them all right, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Missouri, Pennsylvania, Missouri, Florida, no, not Florida, Michigan, and I'm forgetting the last one, but I'll get that to you.
Okay. We have a question from Scott McIntosh of the Idaho State.
Ohio, thank you.
Ohio, okay. Okay, Scott McIntosh from the Idaho Statesman in Boise. This is to all the panelists. Does same-day registration complicate the mailing process? Does it delay results? Anybody have a thought on that one?
I'm not sure, but I don't believe so, because for same-day registration, someone would go to an in-person voting station, so they would cast their ballot on that day, presumably. So I wouldn't expect it would.
I would also add that there's one thing that didn't come up here is that the polling places are not only, they shouldn't only be available on election day. And one of the things that we track, and we have a 50-state chart of what are the practices that are in place in all of the states, especially during a pandemic, we need to see an expanded use of early voting. We want to spread out the voting process. Most states have some form of in-person early voting, certainly 37, I think, generally it's been increasing, and some are adding that just for the pandemic voting. And same-day registration can also take place during the early voting period in most of those jurisdictions that have same-day registration.
And Scott, when you mentioned does it delay results, this is one thing I've been saying all year. People should stop expecting to know on election night who won. The fact is that if you're going to have an in-person site and a mail-in site, you have to have a way to know that if somebody already mailed in a ballot, that they don't then go to the in-person site and vote again, right? And the only way to do that is if they vote again, then you have to go get their mailed-in ballot and throw it away, which means you can't be opening them until after the polls close, right? So you then have to have the question of, do they have the equipment to open all those ballots and read them quickly enough? Do those machines even exist right now if 28 more states want to go buy them? If the Senate sends them $3 billion in July, let's expect the answer to some of those states is going to be no. And what happens on a day after election day when we still don't know the results of enough electoral votes to decide the presidency? Who's going to say, it's unfair? So we are not going to have results in November. I mean, like I said, in 2018, there were I think 4 people who showed up at House orientation who ended up not being in Congress because their races weren't called. So and that was just 2018. Just like expect what that's going to be in 2020.
Okay, so maybe we'll kind of close out on the fraud question, which we haven't actually addressed yet. Wendy, if you could maybe pull up your slide dealing with fraud, and we have a question that deals with that. The question is from Annie Benefield, who's a political science professor in Houston and also with the League of Women Voters in Houston. Does the media feel it's their role to provide accurate and comparative information about voting by mail so the misconceptions being perpetuated about it are debunked? So that's kind of a philosophical question. Maybe Herb could address that in a second. But Wendy, could you maybe just tell us what do the data on fraud show?
So the data on fraud show what I have here on the slide, that mail voting is secure. There's actually a new study that was just out, I think yesterday, that was in the Washington Post. They repeated studies show that the rate of fraud in mail voting, like the rate of fraud in-person voting, is infinitesimally small. You're more likely to be struck by lightning. These are some examples of some of the kind of detailed investigations over a long period of time. There's only a small number of cases that happen nationwide. The reason for this is because there are actually a lot of security features in place. And I think that on the philosophical question, I'm happy to sort of talk through the security features. I think some have already been mentioned, and the identity verification and signature matching, barcodes, secure drop boxes, penalties, the information you put on the envelope. These election officials have over time gotten much better, and also the barcodes key your absentee ballot to your voter record. That's why they know that if you show up at the polling place, that was you, or if your ballot is lost, they can void it and they can send you a new one, and no one else can vote that ballot. So there's multiple layers of security. For me, I think it would be more important to educate voters about what are those security measures and what are the steps that they can take to ensure that their ballot is securely cast and counted as they had intended to do. I think that people should be encouraged to vote absentee early, to do it early, to check their voter registration records. They should be encouraged to make sure that they accurately filled out all the information on the ballot envelope, and they should, and most voters, as was the case in Colorado, that in states that vote principally by mail, actually don't mail in their ballots. They actually drop them off in person, either at secure drop boxes or at other secure drop-off sites, which I think gives voters a lot of confidence that their ballot is received and it's going to be cast. Those are tamper-proof, they're fire-proof, they're equipped with cameras, at least so that nobody can actually destroy those ballots. But that's another thing voters can do. In the states that have smart ballot tracking, they can also track to make sure that where their vote is along the way, whether it was received by election officials when it was counted.
Okay. So Herb, what do you see your role in right now with all the charges being bandied about that vote by mail is rife with fraud? I mean, how many times do you want to write that no, it's not? I mean, how do you cover this issue?
Except we did have an election thrown out just in 2018. I mean, there's opportunities to commit fraud in many places. The question of who handles the ballots, Wendy talks about me as voter dropping it off or me as voter putting it in the mailbox. But if you're going to let people start gathering them, this concept of ballot harvesting, there need to be safeguards. There can be people who do that who probably should be subject to a higher standard of law than just some political consultant or a volunteer on a campaign. I know that there was a candidate, I believe in Georgia, who had COVID, who was running, who had to have an election official come to his house so he could cast his ballot because they hadn't had the rules in place yet to let people vote absentee. So it was, but the fact of the matter is, you have to be careful, you have to be precise, but there are incidences where people do the criminal things with both systems. The other thing is that there are often ballots that are cast incorrectly. We didn't even mention the concept of provisional ballots, which every election administrator calls placebo ballots. It's give the voter something that they can fill out and then leave, and they may never be caught. The reason we don't hear about it all the time is it comes into play if the race is close, and then lawyers start fighting over which sides, which ballots to count. But there is waste. There are votes that spill out of both sides of the funnel. So I can't tell you it favors one party or the other. That's the other thing. Sure. I mean, if you're going to put in-person polling places in place, you have to be prepared that there are going to be people who don't read. There are going to be people who don't follow directions. And there are people who are only used to going to the polling place to vote. So you have to accommodate them as well.
Okay. Wendy, you had a thought?
I just wanted to respond relating to that election in North Carolina's 9th congressional district. That indeed was an effort to, an effort to tamper with ballots. They were collecting, stealing ballots, throwing them out, or trying to alter them. That it was notable both for how rare it was. This is not something that has happened before. It is also notable in that North Carolina is a state that does not allow people to assist in ballot collection. And the states that actually do allow assistance in submitting ballots haven't had similar scandals. So this isn't to say that there aren't wrongdoers who are going to try to, in every one of our voting systems, manipulate or to accomplish fraud. But it is very hard to accomplish it at any scale. And as we saw in North Carolina, it is virtually impossible to do so without being caught.
Right.
And they were caught. And so unfortunately, they were caught not as the election was happening, right afterwards. Typically that's caught beforehand. Election officials that are more attuned to this and now can catch it as the ballots are coming in. People notify if their ballot is missing, they can be voided and they never make it into the count. So that was very anomalous. And I think isn't something that we're concerned about there being a risk for in this election.
Okay, so I just have one more very quick question for Wendy. You mentioned the Heritage Foundation database or report on fraud cases that are out there. You were showing it to kind of document the low number of them overall, but as for it being a document that includes a lot of cases out there that are kind of interesting for anecdotal purposes, do you have a sense whether it's fairly complete? I mean, have they captured most of the cases out there?
So there are multiple such efforts to capture all the cases out there. They have done one. There was one that was some that I also noted, 21 that looked from 2000 to 2012. That was very in-depth with a lot of investigative reporters. There's one that was just now published yesterday by the Washington Post. We have occasionally at the Brennan Center examined this heritage database, but not just their mail voting fraud examples, but all of their fraud examples, and found many of the examples aren't what they purport to say they are, or somewhat misleading in how they are being represented. So we did a report at some point assessing their database in its form a couple of years ago. So I would recommend that to the extent that you hear stories of fraud, you might want to ask further questions. Was this actual fraud? Was there a conviction? Could this just be a reporting error? Was this something that was easily caught? Was this an insider job as opposed to a voter committing fraud? There's, I think, often these stories, there's something else behind them than actual fraud.